The year is 1913. 4 years have passed since the last child vanished. The Missouri Ozarks are caught in the grip of a brutal, unforgiving drought. The sun beats down on the parched earth, cracking the clay soil into a mosaic of fissures. Caldwell Lake, once a proud testament to one man's ambition, has shrunk into a ghost of itself. Its waters have receded by more than 30 feet, exposing a wide, muddy shoreline of bleached tree stumps and forgotten debris. This is where we find him, a lone figure silhouetted against the harsh afternoon light. He is not a lawman nor a grieving father. He is a scavenger, a local man named Jebediah Stone. Hopping the receding water has offered up some lost tool or perhaps a piece of valuable lumber from the homesteads that were drowned to create this very lake. His boots sink into the thick, odorous mud with each step. He scans the shore, his eyes squinting against the glare, and then he sees it. It is small, almost swallowed by the mud, but the shape is unmistakable. A child's boot. It's a high-buttoned shoe, the kind a little girl might have worn. The leather is dark and warped, but shockingly preserved by the cold, oxygen-deprived depths. Jebediah approaches it slowly, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. This isn't just a lost item. He knows the stories. Everyone in the county knows the forbidden tales of the Caldwell children. He kneels, his old joints protesting, and works the boot free from the mud's grip. It comes loose with a sickening, sucking sound. It feels heavy, far too heavy for an empty shoe. With trembling hands, he turns it over. What tumbles out into his palm is not water or silt, but a collection of small, smooth river stones and something else, something small and white. He recognizes them instantly as the knuckle bones from a child's foot. A horrifying, macabre weight designed to make a small body sink and never surface. The official story was a tragic drowning. The truth, Jebediah now realizes, was something far more disturbing. This was not an accident. This was a burial. To understand the horrifying discovery on that parched lake bed, we must travel back to the spring of 1909. The Ozark Hills of southern Missouri were a world unto themselves, a rugged and isolated landscape of dense forests, deep hollows, and limestone bluffs. It was a place where folklore was as real as the rock underfoot, and where communities were bound by shared hardship and deep-seated superstitions. It was into this world that Elias Caldwell arrived, a man who saw not an ancient, untamable wilderness, but a canvas for his own grand vision. Caldwell was not a man of the hills. He came from St. Louis with money earned from a small manufacturing business, and he carried himself with an air of authority that the locals found both impressive and unsettling. He purchased a sprawling, 1,000-acre tract of land centered around a deep, winding valley known as Selah's Hollow. The locals avoided the hollow. They spoke of it in hushed tones, referencing old stories about the soil being sour and the air feeling heavy. They said the place held memories, dark ones that were best left undisturbed. But Elias Caldwell was a man of logic and industry, a disciple of the new century. He scoffed at such tales, dismissing them as the ignorant ramblings of uneducated farmers. He had a plan, a modern marvel for this backward region. He intended to construct a massive earthen dam at the mouth of the hollow, blocking the flow of Selah's Creek and creating the largest privately owned body of water in the county, Caldwell Lake. His dream was to build a grand lodge on its shores, a resort for wealthy city folk seeking a rustic escape. He saw progress and profit where the locals saw only a forbidden place. He could not have known that in damming the creek, he was not just stopping the flow of water, but sealing a macabre secret beneath the rising tide. A secret that would demand a horrifying price from his own family. The Caldwell family settled into a newly constructed farmhouse on a rise overlooking what would soon be the lake. There was Elias, a stern patriarch in his early 40s, driven by a relentless ambition that left little room for sentiment. His wife, Lenora, was his opposite in every way. A pale, quiet woman from a rural background, she was deeply superstitious and ill at ease in the raw, untamed landscape of the Ozarks. She had heard the local whispers about Selah's Hollow and begged Elias to choose another place, but her pleas fell on the deaf ears of a man convinced of his own infallibility. They had 3 children. Samuel, at 14, was a serious and watchful boy, more attuned to his mother's anxieties than his father's grand designs. He spent his days exploring the woods, his face a mask of quiet contemplation. Then there was 8-year-old Lily, a bright, curious girl with her father's determination but her mother's sensitivity. She was fascinated by the work on the dam, spending hours watching the teams of men and mules toil in the valley below. Finally, there was Thomas, barely 6 years old, a shy and imaginative child who lived in a world of his own making. As the dam rose, so did the tension in the Caldwell home. Lenora grew more withdrawn, often seen staring down into the hollow for long stretches, a rosary clutched in her hand. She claimed to hear things at night, faint whispers carried on the wind from the valley floor. Elias dismissed her fears as hysteria, growing more irritable and impatient with each passing day. The construction was his obsession, a monument to his defiance of this backward land and its foolish superstitions. He was building a legacy. The locals, however, saw it differently. They saw a man from the city, arrogant and blind, stirring something that had been intentionally left to slumber. They watched the earthen wall grow, and they waited. They knew the history of that land, the stories their grandparents had told them. It was a place of sorrow, and sorrow, they knew, has a long memory. By the autumn of 1909, the great earthen dam was complete. The iron sluice gate was lowered, and the waters of Sila's Creek began to pool, slowly, inexorably, swallowing the valley floor. The process was agonizingly slow, a creeping flood that consumed the hollow inch by inch. First, the creek bed vanished, its gurgling song silenced. Then, the water crept up the trunks of ancient oaks and sycamores, their leaves turning a sickly yellow before they were submerged. The locals watched from the surrounding ridges, their faces grim. They were witnessing what they considered a desecration. Sila's Hollow had a history, a dark one that was not written in any county record but was etched into the collective memory of the mountain folk. It was said that the last of the Osage tribe had made a final, desperate stand in that valley, and that their spirits still lingered. Others spoke of a small, forgotten settlement from the 1840s that had been wiped out by a sickness so foul. The bodies were buried where they fell, the cabins burned to the ground. But the most persistent and disturbing legend was that of the Sila's Creek hag, a spectral figure said to prey on those who wandered too close to the water's edge after dusk. She was a cautionary tale told to frighten children, but in the shadows of the Ozark Hills, such stories held a potent power. As Caldwell Lake grew, these tales took on a new life. It was said that Elias Caldwell had not just created a lake, he had given the old evils a new home. He had provided them with a dark, silent kingdom in which to wait. He had trapped the ghosts, the sorrows, and the sickness under 100 million gallons of water, and in doing so, he had created a place of immense, concentrated dread. A place that would soon turn its cold, unblinking gaze upon his own children. The placid surface of the new lake reflected the clear autumn sky, but beneath that beautiful facade, a century of darkness was beginning to stir. The first of the Caldwell children to vanish was Lily. It was a crisp October afternoon, the kind where the air is sharp and the sunlight has a golden, fragile quality. The lake had been full for less than a month, a vast, mirror-like expanse that still felt alien and unnatural in the ancient landscape. Lily, ever curious, was enchanted by it. She had been warned repeatedly by her mother not to go near the water alone, but the pull of the lake was irresistible. She was last seen by her older brother, Samuel, skipping down the path toward the newly built boat dock, a small cloth doll clutched in her hand. He had called out to her, reminding her of their mother's rule, but she had just laughed and waved, her bright red ribbon disappearing into the tree line. When she didn't return by supper, a knot of unease began to tighten in Lenora's chest. Elias, at first, was dismissive. Lily was a clever girl, he insisted. She was likely exploring or had lost track of time. But as dusk bled into a deep, starless night, even his resolute facade began to crack. A search was organized. Elias, Samuel, and a few hired hands from the dam project scoured the dense shoreline, their lanterns cutting feeble swaths of light through the oppressive darkness. Their calls of Lily, echoed across the silent water, the sound swallowed by the vast, empty space. They found nothing. Not a footprint, not a dropped ribbon, not her cloth doll. It was as if the earth or the water had simply opened up and taken her. The search continued for 3 days, joined by men from neighboring farms who, despite their distrust of Caldwell, could not refuse a father's plea. They dragged the lake near the dock, their hooks catching on submerged tree limbs and phantom shapes in the murky depths. But they never found Lily. The county sheriff, a portly, overwhelmed man named Brody, declared it a tragic but straightforward case of accidental drowning. A little girl, careless near the water's edge, had slipped and fallen in. The lake was cold, and its bottom was a tangled mess of submerged trees and debris. It was sad, he said, but not uncommon. The lake had simply claimed its first victim. Her body, he assured the grieving family, would likely surface in the spring. But Lenora Caldwell knew better. In her heart, she felt a certainty that was colder and deeper than any lake. Lily hadn't just drowned, she had been taken. Lily's disappearance shattered the Caldwell family, but it did not break them in the same way. The tragedy cleaved the family in two, creating a chasm of grief and blame that grew wider with each passing day. Elias reacted with a cold, simmering fury. He directed his anger outward, at the incompetence of the search party, at the sheriff's quick and simple explanation, and at the land itself. He saw the lake now not as a triumph, but as a treacherous, ungrateful beast that had betrayed him. He became obsessed with work, pushing the plans for his lodge forward with a frantic, desperate energy, as if by building over his grief he could somehow entomb it. He refused to speak of Lily, and her name became a forbidden word in the household. Any mention of her would send him into a stony, impenetrable silence. Lenora, however, collapsed inward. Her pre-existing anxieties and superstitions bloomed into a full-blown paranoia. She saw the lake as a malevolent entity, a living creature that had deliberately stolen her daughter. Her sanity began to fray at the edges, her behavior growing increasingly erratic. She would spend hours at her daughter's bedroom window, staring out at the water with a vacant, haunted expression. She stopped eating, her already frail frame becoming gaunt and spectral. She lined the windowsills and doorways with salt and hung bundles of dried herbs, ancient folk remedies against evil that she had learned from her grandmother. She spoke in whispers of the Seala's Creek hag, convinced the old legend was true, and that this spirit, angered by the flooding of her domain, had exacted a terrible revenge. Samuel, caught between his father's cold denial and his mother's unraveling mind, retreated into himself. The watchful boy became a ghostly presence in the house, his face etched with a sorrow and a fear far beyond his years. He took to watching his younger brother, Thomas, with a fierce, almost suffocating protectiveness. He would not let him out of his sight, and he especially would not let him anywhere near the cold, silent waters of Caldwell Lake. In the months that followed Lily's vanishing, a palpable dread settled over the Caldwell homestead. It was a silence heavier than mere grief. It was the silence of anticipation, of waiting for the other shoe to drop. The focus of this unspoken fear was 6-year-old Thomas. The boy had changed dramatically since his sister's disappearance. Once shy but cheerful, he had become withdrawn and unnervingly quiet. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were often strange and disconnected. He began to spend long hours alone in his room, not playing with his wooden soldiers or toy cars, but drawing. His pictures, sketched on scraps of paper with a piece of charcoal, were deeply disturbing. He drew the lake over and over again, but in his depictions the water was not empty. Just beneath the surface he would draw a tall, thin figure with long, tangled hair and hollow eyes. Sometimes the figure was waving. Other times its long, spindly fingers were reaching up, as if to break through the surface. When Lenora found the drawings, she became hysterical, snatching them from the boy and throwing them into the fire, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She saw them as proof that the evil from the lake was now trying to commune with her remaining child. Elias, when told of the drawings, flew into a rage, forbidding Thomas from ever drawing such morbid fantasies again. He saw it not as a supernatural portent but as a reflection of Lenora's madness infecting his son. But it was a conversation Samuel overheard that truly chilled him to the bone. He heard Thomas whispering to himself in his room one night. Curious, Samuel pressed his ear to the door. Thomas wasn't talking to himself. He was having a conversation. Samuel could only make out his brother's side of it, soft, innocent whispers into the darkness. "I can't come yet," Thomas murmured. "Samuel is watching. She says you miss her. She says it's quiet in the water." Samuel's blood ran cold. He burst into the room, demanding to know who Thomas was talking to. The little boy just stared at him with wide, vacant eyes and said, "The lady in the lake. She has Lily's ribbon in her hair." The winter of 1909 was long and brutal, trapping the Caldwells in their isolated farmhouse with their grief and fear. The lake froze over, its surface a vast, sterile sheet of white, and for a time it seemed as if the horror was dormant, sealed beneath the ice. But as the spring thaw of 1910 arrived, the dread returned with the melting snow. The lake came alive again, its dark waters lapping at the shore, and Lenora's mental state deteriorated further. She became convinced that the lake would not be satisfied with just one child. The curse, she believed, demanded balance. Thomas, meanwhile, seemed to be falling deeper under the spell of his imaginary friend. He would be found near the edge of the woods that bordered the lake, seemingly talking to the water. Samuel did his best to keep him away, but it was an impossible task. Thomas was drawn to the lake with a magnetic, terrifying pull. The breaking point came in late April. Elias had to travel to the county seat for 2 days to secure permits for his lodge. He left Samuel in charge, with strict instructions to watch over his mother and brother. For the first day, a fragile peace held. But on the second morning, Samuel awoke to a terrifying silence. His mother was asleep in her room, sedated by a laudanum tonic the doctor had prescribed for her nerves. But Thomas's bed was empty. A frantic search of the house and the immediate yard revealed nothing. Then Samuel saw it. The back door was slightly ajar, and on the muddy path leading toward the lake he saw a single set of small, bare footprints. Panic, cold, and absolute seized him. He sprinted down the path, his heart hammering against his ribs, his calls for Thomas growing more desperate with each step. He ran to the dock, the place where Lily had last been seen. The small rowboat Elias kept tied there was gone. Samuel scanned the vast, placid surface of the lake, his eyes darting back and forth, praying for any sign of his brother. And then he saw it. About 50 yards from shore, floating gently on the calm water, was one of Thomas's small wooden soldiers. Nothing else. Just the solitary toy bobbing on the waves, a silent, horrifying testament to what had just happened. Thomas was gone. The lake had taken another. The disappearance of a second child in less than 6 months transformed the Caldwell case from a local tragedy into a macabre regional legend. This time, there was no simple explanation. Thomas was not a curious girl who might have slipped. He was a fearful boy who, according to his older brother, had developed a profound terror of the water. Furthermore, the missing rowboat added a layer of disturbing mystery to the event. Sheriff Brody returned to the Caldwell property, his demeanor now far less dismissive. The community was in an uproar, and the whispers about a curse on Caldwell Lake had grown into a roar of fearful certainty. The search for Thomas was larger and more frantic than the one for Lily, but it was just as fruitless. The rowboat was found a day later, washed ashore on the far side of the lake, empty save for a single oar. There was no sign of a struggle, no damage to the boat. It was as if its occupant had simply ceased to exist. Divers were brought in from a larger town, but their efforts were hampered by the abysmal conditions. The lake bottom was a treacherous, lightless forest of submerged trees, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching up from the depths. They found nothing. During the investigation, Sheriff Brody questioned a distraught and near catatonic Samuel, who told him about Thomas's drawings and his whispers about the lady in the lake. The sheriff, a practical man, documented the boy's story but dismissed it as the fantasy of a traumatized child. He was looking for a human culprit, a kidnapper, perhaps a drifter who had been working on the dam. But there was no evidence. No ransom note, no witnesses, no strangers reported in the area. The case was a complete and baffling dead end. When Elias Caldwell returned home to the news, the man finally broke. His rage and denial crumbled, replaced by a hollow, vacant despair. The loss of one child was a tragedy. The loss of two was a damnation. He looked out at the vast, impassive body of water he had created, and for the first time he saw it through his wife's eyes, as a living, breathing monster that had deliberately, methodically devoured his family. With the second vanishing, the folklore surrounding Sela's Hollow solidified into accepted fact among the local population. The story of the Sela's Creek hag was no longer a children's tale. It was the only explanation that made sense of the senseless horror. They said Elia's Caldwell's arrogance had woken her up, and the creation of the lake had given her a power she hadn't possessed when she was merely the spirit of a shallow creek. Fear of the lake became a palpable force in the county. Parents forbade their children from going anywhere near its shores. Fishermen who had once eagerly anticipated the new lake now refused to cast their lines in its dark waters. The property, once a symbol of progress, became a shunned and blighted place. This atmosphere of terror was a fertile ground for stories, and the tales grew more elaborate and disturbing with each telling. Some claimed to have seen a pale woman with long, dark hair walking along the shoreline at dusk before vanishing into thin air. Others reported hearing a child's laughter echoing across the water on moonless nights, a sound that would quickly turn into a sorrowful weeping. These stories cemented the lake's reputation as a cursed and forbidden place. The Caldwell name itself became synonymous with tragedy and hubris. The dream of a grand lodge, a bustling resort for the wealthy, was now a dead and buried fantasy. No one would ever willingly come to this place for recreation. It had become a monument to grief. If you find these explorations into forgotten and forbidden histories compelling, consider subscribing to our channel. We are dedicated to unearthing the stories that have been deliberately buried, because the official record is often just a pale imitation of the much darker truth. The truth of what happened at Caldwell Lake was no exception, and it was far more macabre than any ghost story. The aftermath of Thomas's disappearance left the remaining Caldwells as ghosts haunting their own home. Lenora's mind, already fragile, shattered completely. She retreated into a world of silent, waking nightmares, often found rocking back and forth in a corner, muttering Lily and Thomas's names under her breath. She refused to look out the windows, covering them with thick blankets to block the view of the lake, which she now referred to only as the Hunger. Her descent was swift and total, leaving her incapable of caring for herself or anyone else. Elias, consumed by a toxic cocktail of guilt and rage, became a recluse. His ambition was replaced by a burning, obsessive hatred for the body of water he had created. He would spend his days packing the shoreline, his face a mask of anguish, sometimes shouting obscenities at the impassive water. He neglected his farm, his business affairs, and his remaining son. His world had shrunk to the size of his loss, and at its center was the lake, his creation, his enemy, his tomb. Samuel was left to navigate this landscape of ruin alone. At 15, he became the de facto head of a household populated by the mentally and emotionally broken. He cared for his mother, ensuring she ate what little she would accept. He endured his father's dark moods and explosive rages. He was an island of strained sanity in a sea of madness. But the boy was also plagued by his own demons. He was haunted by guilt, believing he had failed to protect both of his siblings. He replayed that final morning in his mind 1,000 times, wondering what he could have done differently. He, too, began to fear the lake, but his fear was different from his parents'. It was colder, more analytical. He didn't believe in the Sela's Creek hag. He believed something far worse. He believed that what had taken his brother and sister was not a spirit, but something terrifyingly human. Sheriff Brody, despite his limited resources and the lack of any real evidence, couldn't shake the Caldwell case. The official file was closed, the disappearances listed as presumed drowned, bodies not recovered. But the neatness of the conclusion felt wrong. 2 children from the same family vanished without a trace from the same location in 6 months was a statistical anomaly too glaring to ignore. He found himself returning to Samuel's strange testimony about Thomas's lady in the lake. While he didn't believe in ghosts, He wondered if it was a clue. Had Thomas been lured away by a real woman? Brody quietly investigated the histories of the families that had been bought out by Elias Caldwell to create the lake. He wondered if there was some lingering resentment, some local with a grudge strong enough to manifest in such a monstrous way. He interviewed the families one by one. Most were simple farmers, resentful of the city man's money but ultimately resigned. They spoke of the hollow with a fearful reverence, repeating the old stories of curses and bad blood, but none showed any sign of violent intent. However, one name kept coming up in hushed tones: the Prentice family. They had been the last to hold out, a reclusive and strange clan who had lived in the deepest part of the hollow for generations. The patriarch, Old Man Prentice, had died a decade earlier, but his two sons and a daughter were said to be not right in the head. They had fought Caldwell's purchase bitterly, claiming the land was sacred to their family. They had eventually taken his money and moved, disappearing into the remote backwoods on the other side of the county. Brody made a note of it. A family with a history of mental instability, a deep connection to the flooded land, and a grudge against the Caldwells. It was the first tangible thread of a human-led conspiracy he had found, a disturbing alternative to the supernatural horror everyone else had accepted as truth. Elias Caldwell's grief began to curdle into a dangerous and singular obsession. He was a man of action and industry, and the passive acceptance of his fate was a torment he could not endure. If the law could not give him answers, and if his wife's prayers were useless, he would find the truth himself. He became convinced that the lake held the physical evidence of the crime. The bodies of his children were down there, and with them, the secret of what had happened. His hatred for the water became a living thing, a personal vendetta against an inanimate object. He started with a grim and fruitless ritual. Every day, he would take his remaining rowboat out onto the lake, a long iron pole in his hand, and he would probe the depths. He spent weeks and then months engaged in this macabre task, dragging the pole along the bottom, hopping to snag on a piece of clothing, a bone, a clue. The effort was futile. The lake was too deep, the bottom too cluttered with the debris of the former hollow. The locals would watch him from the hills, a tiny, pathetic figure in a boat, a man at war with a body of water. They saw it as proof that the curse had finally driven him mad. But Elias was not just aimlessly searching. He was mapping. With each pass, he was learning the contours of the world he had drowned. He was reacquainting himself with the landscape of his crime, for in his mind, the creation of the lake was the original sin that had led to all this sorrow. His methodical, obsessive probing was leading him to a conclusion that seemed, to everyone else, like the very pinnacle of insanity. If the lake would not give up its dead, he would force it to. He would not just search the lake, he would destroy it. He began to formulate a plan, a feat of engineering born from pure desperation. He was going to drain Caldwell Lake. The idea of draining the lake was seen by the community as the final, definitive proof of Elias Caldwell's madness. It was a monumental undertaking, a task that would require immense labor and expense, all for the sake of a grief-driven fantasy. Sheriff Brody tried to reason with him, arguing that after more than a year, there would be little left to find. His friends from the city wrote letters, urging him to sell the property and return to civilization to heal. But Elias was beyond reason. He liquidated his remaining assets in St. Louis, sold off timber rights to the forests on his land, and poured every last penny into his horrifying project. He hired a crew of laborers, a motley collection of desperate men willing to take on the strange, grim work for a decent wage. The plan was audacious. They couldn't simply open the sluice gate on the dam. The uncontrolled release of water would cause a catastrophic flood in the valleys below. Instead, they had to dig a massive diversion trench, a new channel that would snake around the side of the dam and slowly bleed the water out of the lake, redirecting the flow of Sila's Creek back to its original, meandering path. The work began in the spring of 1911. It was slow, backbreaking labor. The sounds of dynamite blasting through rock and the scrape of shovels against earth replaced the once pastoral silence of the hills. Samuel, now 16, watched the proceedings with a mixture of hope and dread. A part of him, the logical part, knew this was a fool's errand. But another, deeper part, the part that still yearned for answers, clung to the desperate hope that his father's madness might just uncover the truth. He hoped they would find his siblings, give them a proper burial, and bring some semblance of closure to their shattered lives. He had no idea that the truth waiting at the bottom of the lake was infinitely more disturbing than the simple discovery of two lost children. As the diversion trench deepened and the water level of Caldwell Lake began its slow, deliberate descent, a strange and eerie transformation occurred. The landscape that had been hidden for 2 years began to re-emerge, but it was a corrupted, spectral version of its former self. The tops of the tallest trees broke the surface first, their branches bare and coated in a slimy, greenish-brown algae, like the grasping hands of the drowned. As the water receded further, the shoreline expanded, revealing a vast, desolate wasteland of mud and decaying organic matter. The stench was overpowering, a thick, putrid smell of decomposition that hung in the air for miles. This new, exposed ground was a graveyard. The skeletons of fish and other small animals were everywhere, tangled in the roots of skeletal trees. But there were other, more unsettling discoveries. A farmer's submerged fence line reappeared, its wire rusted and its posts rotted. The stone foundation of an old barn emerged from the muck, looking like the ruin of some ancient, forgotten civilization. Each re-emergent landmark was a ghost, a reminder of the life that had been forcibly extinguished to create this cursed lake. The process had a profound effect on Lenora Caldwell. Though she had covered her windows, she could not escape the pervasive stench of the dying lake. To her it was the smell of the beast's insides, the foulness of its soul being exposed to the air. Her madness took on a new, prophetic quality. She began to speak of what lay at the bottom, not of her children, but of an older evil. "He thinks he's looking for our Bobbies," she whispered to Samuel one night, her eyes wide with a terrifying lucidity. "But you can't find what was never lost. They're just the latest ones. The soil knows. The soil remembers all the little bones." Her words, dismissed as the ramblings of a broken mind, would later prove to be a horrifyingly accurate prediction. The work continued for months, a grim and relentless assault on the lake. By the late summer of 1911, the water level had dropped by more than 50 feet, reducing the once mighty lake to a series of large, stagnant pools connected by muddy channels. The floor of Sela's Hollow was almost fully exposed. It was a horrifying sight, a scarred and desolate landscape that looked like the aftermath of a great battle. The ground was a thick, sucking morass of silt and mud, littered with the ghostly, slime-coated remains of the drowned forest. Elias Caldwell, gaunt and wild-eyed, drove his work crew mercilessly, his obsession growing more feverish as the water level dropped. He was a man possessed, wading through the mud himself, his expensive boots ruined, his face smeared with dirt. He was searching for any sign of his children, a scrap of cloth, a bone, anything. He found nothing. The absence of evidence was, in its own way, more terrifying than finding their remains. If they hadn't drowned, if their bodies weren't tangled in the submerged debris, then what had happened to them? The mystery deepened, taking on a more sinister human shape. It was during this phase of the project that Sheriff Brody returned, drawn by reports of Caldwell's bizarre undertaking. He walked the perimeter of the drained hollow with Elias, the two men surveying the surreal, nightmarish landscape. Brody was still troubled by the Prentice family, the strange recluses who had once lived in this very hollow. He asked Elias to show him where their old homestead had been. Elias pointed toward the deepest part of the valley, to a spot where a particularly large, stagnant pool of dark water remained. "They lived right down there," Elias said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Their cabin sat right next to the creek, the deepest part of this whole damned place." A cold feeling washed over Sheriff Brody as he stared at that final, dark pool of water. It felt as though the hollow was refusing to give up its final secret. The final stage of the draining required the use of steam-powered pumps, brought in at great expense, to empty the last and deepest sections of the former lake bed. As the muddy water was siphoned out of the pool where the Prentice homestead once stood, The ground began to reveal its secrets. First, the stone foundation of the old cabin emerged. It was small and crudely built, the work of people who lived a hard, isolated life. Then, as the mud and silt were cleared away, the workers discovered something else, something not on any of Elias Caldwell's original survey maps. Near the center of the cabin's foundation was a perfectly square, heavy stone slab, about 4 feet by 4 feet. It was clearly man-made, and its edges were sealed with a dark, hardened pitch. It looked like the cover to a well or a cistern. An immediate sense of foreboding fell over the work crew. This was not a normal feature of a simple homesteader's cabin. Elias, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and vindication, ordered the men to pry it open. It took 4 men with heavy iron crowbars to break the seal and slide the massive stone slab aside. As it moved, it released a rush of foul, stagnant air from the darkness below, a cold, cellar-like smell that carried with it a faint, sweet odor of decay. Peering into the opening, they saw a set of steep stone steps leading down into absolute blackness. It was a root cellar, but it was unusually deep and fortified, its entrance deliberately and carefully sealed. It was a place meant to hide something, a place meant to be forgotten. A cold, dreadful certainty settled upon Elias and Sheriff Brody. They were no longer searching for the victims of a tragic drowning. They had stumbled upon a tomb. And they were about to discover that Lily and Thomas were not its only occupants. The descent into the Prentice family's hidden cellar was like a journey into the heart of a long-dormant evil. Sheriff Brody went first, his lantern cutting a weak, trembling circle of light in the oppressive dark. Elias and Samuel followed close behind, their boots echoing on the damp stone steps. The air grew colder and thicker with each step, heavy with the smell of damp earth and something else, something sickly sweet and cloying. The cellar was small, no more than 10 feet square, with stone walls that wept with a dark, oily moisture. The floor was packed earth, but it was what lay on the floor that made the men freeze, their breath catching in their throats. In the center of the room was a small, pitiful pile of children's clothing. A little girl's dress, a boy's worn trousers, a small knitted sweater. Samuel let out a choked cry as he recognized a small piece of red ribbon, identical to the one Lily had worn in her hair on the day she disappeared. Next to the clothing was another pile, this one containing a collection of small, simple toys, a carved wooden horse, a set of marbles, and a small, hand-painted wooden soldier, exactly like the one that had been found floating on the lake. It was a collection of trophies, a horrifying, macabre archive of stolen childhoods. But the most disturbing discovery was in the corner. There, half buried in the damp earth, were several heavy burlap sacks, tied at the top with thick rope. Sheriff Brody cautiously approached one, his hand shaking as he drew his pocket knife. He sliced through the ropes and pulled the sack open. He didn't need to look inside. The contents spilled out onto the floor, a collection of small, unnervingly white bones, mixed with smooth, heavy river stones. The same kind of stones Jebediah Stone would find in a little girl's boot 2 years later. They were weights, used to sink the sacks in the deep pools of Sela's Creek long before the lake had ever existed. This cellar was not a tomb. It was a workshop. The horrifying discovery in the cellar shifted the narrative of the Caldwell mystery from a tale of supernatural curses to a far more grounded and grotesque story of human depravity. Sheriff Brody, now faced with a full-blown murder investigation, immediately dispatched a deputy to track down the whereabouts of the remaining Prentice family members. The cellar was excavated with care, and the full, sickening scope of the horror was revealed. They unearthed the remains of at least 7 different children from the weighted sacks. Forensic analysis at the time was rudimentary, but it was clear that the victims ranged in age from 5 to 10 years old, and that the deaths spanned decades. The bones of Lily and Thomas Caldwell were among the most recent, but there were others, far older, some so brittle they crumbled to dust when touched. The Prentice family had been using Sela's Hollow as their private dumping ground for generations. The Sela's Creek hag was not a ghost, it was them. They were the monsters who lured children to the water's edge. The construction of Caldwell Lake must have seemed like a gift to them, a perfect, modern solution to hide their historic crimes under 100 feet of water, sealing their secrets forever. It explained Thomas's lady in the lake. He hadn't been speaking to a ghost. He had likely been speaking to the Prentice daughter, a real, living woman who had coaxed him into the rowboat, continuing her family's macabre tradition. The case that had baffled the county for 2 years was suddenly cracked wide open, revealing a truth so dark and disturbing it was almost incomprehensible. This was not a curse upon the Caldwells. They were simply the latest victims of a long, unbroken chain of evil that had festered in the isolation of the Ozark Hills for half a century. The search for the Prentice clan became a matter of extreme urgency. Sheriff Brody learned that the two brothers, Caleb and Jacob, and their sister Elspeth, had purchased a small, isolated tract of land deep in the forests of a neighboring county. They lived as they always had, cut off from society, shunning all contact with the outside world. Brody assembled a posse of 5 armed men. He knew this would not be a simple arrest. He was dealing with a family of predators who had been killing for generations and would not be taken easily. The journey to the Prentice homestead was arduous, a 2-day ride through rough, unmarked country. As they drew closer, a sense of unease fell over the men. The woods grew darker and more silent, as if the land itself was tainted by the family's presence. They found the cabin in a small, squalid clearing. It was a dilapidated shack, more hovel than home, with filth and animal bones littering the yard. There was no sign of life. Brody and his men approached cautiously, their rifles raised. The front door hung open on a single hinge. Inside, they found a scene of utter chaos. The cabin had been ransacked, its meager contents strewn across the floor, but there was no sign of the Prentices. They had fled. A search of the property, however, yielded a final, chilling piece of evidence. In a shallow pit behind the cabin, hidden under a pile of dead leaves, the posse found the body of a man. It was a local trapper who had been reported missing 2 weeks prior. He had been shot. It was clear what had happened. The Prentices had heard about Caldwell draining the lake. They knew their secrets were about to be uncovered. They had likely killed the trapper because he had stumbled upon them as they were preparing to flee, and then they had vanished into the vast, untamed wilderness of the Ozarks. The hunt was now for 3 fugitive murderers, who had a head start and an intimate knowledge of the unforgiving landscape. The revelation of the Prentice family's crimes sent a shockwave of terror and fury through the region. The story was picked up by newspapers in St. Louis and Kansas City, transforming the sad tale of the Caldwells into a sensational story of rural horror. The once whispered folklore of the Ozarks was now presented as the backdrop for a real-life nightmare, a story of a feral, inbred family of killers preying on the innocent for decades. The discovery in the cellar solved many of the region's forgotten cold cases. Parents and grandparents of children who had vanished without a trace years, even decades, earlier now had a horrifying answer to their lifelong questions. The hollow had always been a place of death. The lake had just been the latest chapter. For Elias Caldwell, the discovery provided no comfort. The knowledge that his children's deaths were the result of human hands, not a supernatural curse, only deepened his despair. His quest for answers was over, but the truth was a poison that offered no peace. The guilt was unbearable. He had brought his family to this cursed place. He had dismissed the local warnings as foolish superstitions. His ambition and arrogance, he believed, had led his children directly into the hands of monsters. The man who had once been a pillar of industry and logic was now a hollow shell, haunted by the faces of his murdered children and the weight of his own perceived failures. He locked himself away in his farmhouse, refusing to see or speak to anyone, including his last remaining son, Samuel. The house on the hill, which was meant to overlook a beautiful resort, now overlooked a scarred, muddy pit that served as an open grave, a constant, stinking reminder of all he had lost. The truth had been found, but salvation had not. The manhunt for the Prentice siblings was one of the largest in Missouri's history at the time. Sheriff Brody coordinated with law enforcement across 3 states, and bounty hunters, drawn by the substantial reward money, flooded into the Ozarks. But the prentices were like ghosts. They had been born and raised in the wilderness, and they knew how to live off the land, how to disappear into the dense forests and labyrinthine cave systems that riddled the region. For months, the search turned up nothing but cold trails and false sightings. They were a part of the landscape, and the landscape protected its own. As the search dragged on, the legend of the Prentice family grew. They were no longer just human fugitives. They were transformed back into the folklore they had inspired. They became the bogeymen of the Ozarks, supernatural figures who could walk without leaving tracks and see in the dark. Stories of their depravity, likely exaggerated but rooted in a terrifying reality, were told around campfires and in general stores. It was said they were cannibals, that they practiced dark rituals in the woods, that they were the descendants of a cursed bloodline. The truth was horrifying enough, but the mythology that grew around them served a purpose. It was a way for people to try and comprehend an evil so profound it defied rational explanation. By turning the Prentices into monsters of folklore, it made their actions seem less human, and therefore somehow less possible. They were a throwback to a more primitive, savage time, a living embodiment of the darkness that civilization had tried and failed to tame in the rugged hills of the Ozarks. Despite the massive effort, Caleb, Jacob, and Elspeth Prentice were never caught. They vanished completely, leaving behind nothing but a legacy of terror and a string of shallow graves. The final act of the Caldwell family tragedy played out not with a bang, but with a slow, agonizing fade into oblivion. With the mystery solved but the perpetrators at large, the last threads holding the family together finally snapped. One morning in the winter of 1912, Samuel Caldwell awoke to find his father gone. Elias had packed a small bag with some food and his hunting rifle and had simply walked away from the farmhouse, heading west into the desolate, drained valley. There was no note, no final words. He just vanished into the landscape that had consumed the rest of his family. Some believed he went into the wilderness to hunt the Prentices himself, seeking a final, violent revenge. Others, more realistically, believed he had simply surrendered to his despair, walking into the woods to die, a final, solitary penance for his perceived sins. His body was never found. He became the last victim of Caldwell Lake. Shortly after her husband's disappearance, Lenora Caldwell was committed to the state psychiatric hospital in Fulton. Her mind was gone, lost forever in a world of ghosts and whispers. She would live out the rest of her days in the sterile, quiet halls of the asylum, the last official survivor of a family utterly annihilated by a darkness they had never understood. Samuel, now 17 and completely alone, was the sole heir to the blighted property and its horrifying history. He could not bear to stay there a moment longer. He sold the entire 1,000-acre tract of land, including the dam and the empty, scarred hollow, to a timber company for a pittance. He took the money, packed a single suitcase, and boarded a train heading east. He never looked back. He changed his name and severed all ties to his past, determined to erase the stain of the Caldwell name and the horrors it represented. The story of Caldwell Lake was over. The land, however, remained. The timber company that purchased the Caldwell property had no interest in lakes or resorts. They were interested in the vast tracts of old-growth forest on the surrounding hills. For several years, they logged the area extensively. They had no use for the massive earthen dam or the complex diversion trench Elias Caldwell had built. At some point around 1915, after they had harvested most of the valuable timber, they simply abandoned the property. Without maintenance, the diversion trench, which had been carved from earth and rock, began to collapse. Silt and debris carried by the rains slowly filled it in. One spring, during a period of heavy storms, a landslide completely blocked the trench. Sela's Creek, its temporary detour now impassable, began to follow the path of least resistance. It began to pool once more behind the massive, forgotten earthen dam. The water started to rise again. Slowly, inexorably, the process that Elias Caldwell had initiated years before, and then desperately reversed, began all over again. The scarred, muddy floor of the hollow, with its ghostly tree stumps and the exposed foundations of the Prentice cabin, was gradually submerged. The scene of the horrifying discovery, The cellar where so much evil had been perpetrated and then uncovered was inundated. The water crept higher and higher, silencing the whispers of the past, covering the evidence of the crime. Within a decade, Caldwell Lake was full again. To a stranger passing by, it looked like a beautiful, natural body of water, its placid surface reflecting the sky, its shores once again green and lush. There was no sign of the dam, now overgrown with weeds and trees. There was no marker for the graves. There was no hint of the macabre history sealed beneath its calm, quiet depths. The landscape had reclaimed its secret. The horrifying history of the place had been, once again, completely and totally submerged. Decades passed. The story of the Caldwells and the Prentice clan faded from newspaper headlines and became what it had always been, a dark piece of local folklore. The name Caldwell Lake was lost to time, and locals reverted to calling the area by its original ominous name, Sela's Hollow. The lake itself remained, a beautiful but shunned feature of the landscape. People in the know, the ones whose grandparents had passed down the true story, still avoided it. They knew what lay at the bottom, both in terms of physical remains and in the lingering stain of the evil that had occurred there. The official records of the case, held in the county courthouse, became a source of morbid curiosity. But over time, even those began to fade. A courthouse fire in the 1940s destroyed a significant portion of the county's old records, and the Caldwell-Prentice file was believed to be among them. The story was now almost entirely an oral history, a forbidden tale told in hushed tones, its details shifting and changing with each retelling. The human element of the Prentice family began to fade, and the supernatural element, the story of the cursed lake and the Sela's Creek hag, once again took prominence. It was a simpler, less disturbing explanation for the horrors of the past. It was easier to believe in a vengeful spirit than in a family of human monsters who looked just like your neighbors. The draining of the lake, the discovery in the cellar, the manhunt, these facts became hazy, distorted by time, until they seemed more like the stuff of legend than of history. The lake had effectively erased its own sordid past, its deep, cold water acting as the ultimate guardian of its secrets. The truth was not just buried, it was drowned all over again, and this time there was no obsessive father to uncover it. We now return to 1913, and to Jebediah Stone, kneeling in the mud on the shore of the drought-shrunken lake, holding a child's boot filled with bones and stones. His discovery, made possible only by a once-in-a-generation dry spell, briefly resurrected the ghost of the Caldwell case. He took the boot to the new sheriff, a young man who had only heard of the Prentice clan as a local boogeyman story. The discovery prompted a new, albeit limited, search of the exposed lakebed. This time, however, they knew what they were looking for. Investigators focused on the area where the old Prentice cabin was known to have stood. The cellar had been filled in with dirt and debris after the 1911 investigation, but its stone outline was still visible. A new, more scientific excavation began. They reopened the cellar and dug deeper into the packed earth floor. What they found was even more disturbing than the original discovery. The Prentice family's evil ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Buried beneath the floor of the cellar, they found another, older layer of remains. These bones were far more decayed, some little more than fragments. They belonged to at least 4 more children. This suggested that the Prentice family's macabre activities predated even the oldest known missing child cases in the county. This was not a tradition that had started with Caleb, Jacob, and Elspeth. It went back at least 1 generation further to their father, Old Man Prentice, and perhaps even beyond. The evil in Sela's Hollow was an heirloom, a dark inheritance passed down from father to son, a horrifying family tradition practiced in the shadows of their isolated existence. The place was not just the site of a series of murders, it was an ancestral killing ground. The sheer scale of the depravity, spanning multiple generations, was almost impossible for the community to comprehend. Jebediah's discovery and the subsequent excavation in 1913 created a disturbing addendum to the Caldwell Lake story, but it led to no new arrests and no final justice. The Prentice siblings were still ghosts, long gone, their trail colder than the grave. The discovery of the older remains only served to deepen the mystery and amplify the horror associated with the land. It confirmed that the evil was older and more ingrained in the hollow soil than anyone had ever dared to imagine. This is often how these dark histories unfold, not with a clean resolution, but with layers of horror peeled back over time, each layer more disturbing than the last. The stories we cover on this channel are rarely about neat conclusions. They are about the lingering questions and the shadows that historical events cast upon the present. If you believe these stories need to be told and that the forgotten victims deserve to be remembered, help us by hitting the like button and sharing this documentary. Your engagement ensures these banned and buried histories are brought into the light. The story of Sela's Hollow serves as a chilling reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not spirits or curses, but human beings, and the secrets they keep can be far deeper and darker than any lake. The final fate of the land and the lake itself is perhaps the most chilling part of the entire tale. It became a place where memory and myth merged into a single, horrifying narrative. After the 1913 investigation, the drought eventually broke. The rains returned, and Caldwell Lake began to fill once more, its waters rising to cover the reopened cellar and its newly discovered horrors. This time, the drowning of the secret felt final. The community, having been forced to confront the true, generational depth of the Prentice family's evil, seemed to make a collective, unspoken decision to forget. They had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back. They wanted nothing more to do with it. The story became truly forbidden, a topic so dark and painful that it was actively suppressed. Parents stopped telling the story of the Sela's Creek hag, for fear that the real history was too terrible for children to even hear in its mythologized form. The land was sold and resold several times over the next few decades, but no one ever tried to develop it again. It was left wild. The dam held, the lake remained, and the forest grew back thick and tangled around its shores. By the mid-20th century, the place was remote and inaccessible once more, visited only by the most intrepid hunters or fishermen, most of whom knew nothing of its history. The lake had won. It had successfully buried a multi-generational murder spree beneath a veneer of natural, placid beauty. It stands today as a terrifying monument to the power of a landscape to conceal human darkness. It is a reminder that the serene beauty of the natural world can often mask a history of unimaginable horror. The water is clear, the trees are tall, but the soil is soaked in the memory of unspeakable acts, and the silence that hangs over the lake is filled with the echoes of lost children. What can we learn from a story this macabre? The mystery of Caldwell Lake is a chilling case study in what can happen in isolated communities, where secrets can be kept, and strange behavior can be dismissed as simple eccentricity. The Prentice family was able to carry out their horrifying acts for decades, protected by the remoteness of their location and the insular nature of the society around them. Their neighbors may have thought them strange, but they could not have conceived of the true nature of their depravity. The story also serves as a powerful allegory for the nature of evil itself. At first, it was perceived as something supernatural, a curse, a ghost. This is often how we process events that are too horrible to understand in human terms. A vengeful spirit is, in some ways, a more comforting explanation than the knowledge that people who look just like us are capable of such monstrous things. Elias Caldwell's journey from a man of logic to a believer in the lake's malevolence, and then finally his confrontation with the human source of the horror, mirrors society's own struggle to comprehend such acts. He tried to fight the curse with engineering, by draining the lake, only to find a far more tangible and disturbing enemy waiting for him in the mud. He learned the hard way that you cannot dynamite a human legacy of hatred and violence. You cannot drain the darkness from the human heart. His final act of walking into the wilderness was perhaps an admission of this fact, a surrender to a force that his modern, rational mind could not defeat. The story leaves us with a host of chilling, unresolved questions that contribute to its lasting power. Chief among them is the fate of the Prentice siblings. Did they escape to a new region and continue their horrifying family tradition under new names? Or did the wilderness they fled into ultimately consume them, delivering a final, brutal justice that the law never could? The Ozark wilderness is vast and unforgiving. It is entirely possible their bones lie in some undiscovered cave or at the bottom of a remote ravine. There is also the question of motive. Why did they do it? The investigation never uncovered a clear reason for the killings. It wasn't for ransom or any other discernible gain. The collection of toys and clothing in the cellar suggests a ritualistic, trophy-taking behavior, the work of minds completely detached from normal human empathy. Was it a form of madness passed down through their bloodline? Or was it a learned behavior, a tradition of violence taught by a monstrous father to his children? The lack of a clear motive makes their actions even more terrifying. It was not evil for a purpose. It was, it seems, evil for its own sake. A pure, undiluted malevolence that existed and festered in the isolation of Selah's Hollow. The absence of answers is part of what makes the story so deeply disturbing. It denies us the comfort of closure, leaving us to contemplate the unsettling reality that some forms of darkness are simply incomprehensible. Let us consider the character of Samuel Caldwell, the forgotten survivor. He is, in many ways, the story's most tragic figure. He witnessed the destruction of his entire family. He was old enough to understand the horror but too young to stop it. He lived in a house with a grieving, absent father and a mother descending into madness, all while carrying the terrible secret of his brother's conversations with the lady in the lake. He was the one who followed the small, bare footprints to the shore. He was the one who descended into that foul cellar and saw the proof of his siblings' fate. He survived the events, but it is impossible to believe he was ever truly free of them. His decision to change his name and disappear speaks volumes. He was not just leaving a place. He was trying to outrun a memory, to escape a history that was too heavy to carry. One can only imagine the ghosts that haunted him for the rest of his life. Did he ever find peace? Did he ever have a family of his own? And if so, did he live in constant fear that the curse of his past would somehow find him? His story is a poignant and disturbing reminder that the victims of such crimes are not only the ones who lose their lives. The trauma ripples outward, scarring and shaping the lives of those left behind, the survivors who are tasked with the impossible burden of remembering. Samuel Caldwell carried the entire weight of his family's horror on his shoulders, a silent, walking testament to the long shadow cast by the dark waters of the lake. Today, the land where the Caldwell homestead once stood is part of a state forest. The lake is still there, marked on maps simply as Selah's Lake. It is known as a good spot for fishing, though access is difficult. There is no plaque, no monument, no sign at all to indicate the events that transpired there over a century ago. The forest has reclaimed the old farm fields. The dam is almost invisible, and the horrors of the past are completely hidden from view. But does a place ever truly forget? The core of this story is the idea of a tainted landscape, a place where so much tragedy has occurred that it leaves a permanent stain. The locals in 1909 believed Selah's Hollow was sour. They were right, but they mistook the cause. The evil was not in the soil or the water. It was in the people who inhabited it. Yet their actions became so intertwined with the place that the two are now inseparable. The cellar is still down there, submerged in the cold, dark water. The bones that were not recovered during the investigations are still scattered in the silt. The lake is, quite literally, a watery grave. It is a beautiful, serene place that holds a deeply macabre secret. And this, perhaps, is the most disturbing thought of all. How many other beautiful places in the world hold similar secrets? How many serene landscapes mask a history of violence and despair? The story of Caldwell Lake is a chilling reminder that the past is never truly gone. It is merely submerged, waiting for a drought or a curious historian to bring its horrifying secrets back to the surface. The final, lingering question is whether the cycle of violence truly ended with the disappearance of the Prentice siblings. The narrative of generational evil is a powerful and disturbing one. The idea that such a capacity for murder could be passed down like a physical trait suggests a form of evil that is almost elemental, a blight on a bloodline. While Caleb, Jacob, and Elspeth were never caught, it is statistically unlikely that they managed to evade capture for the rest of their natural lives without leaving some trace. It is more probable that they met a quiet, anonymous end deep in the wilderness they knew so well. But the story leaves the door open to a more sinister possibility. Did one of them survive? Did they have children of their own, raising them in the same isolated, twisted way they were raised, passing on the horrifying family trade? It is a deeply unsettling thought. The idea that the Prentice legacy might not have ended in the Ozarks in 1911, but may have simply moved on, a dormant cancer waiting to resurface in another remote, forgotten corner of the country. This lack of resolution is what elevates the story from a simple cold case to the level of modern folklore. The Prentice family transcended their own mortal lives to become an archetype of rural horror, an embodiment of the fear of what lies hidden beyond the edge of civilization, in the dark woods and the quiet, lonely places of the world. They are a reminder that some evil is not meant to be understood, only to be feared. The disturbing mystery of Caldwell Lake that swallowed its children is ultimately a story about the deceptive nature of surfaces. The calm surface of the lake concealed a drowned world of horror. The surface of the Prentice family's reclusive existence concealed a multi-generational spree of unimaginable evil. The surface of Elias Caldwell's modern, rational ambition concealed a foolish pride that made him blind to the ancient warnings of the land. In the end, the truth was always there, just beneath the surface, waiting to be revealed. The tale has become a forbidden legend in the Missouri Ozarks, a story that exists in the twilight between historical fact and campfire horror. It serves as a grim warning about digging into the past, both literally and figuratively. Elias Caldwell drained a lake to find the truth, and the truth destroyed him. The story cautions us that some secrets are buried for a reason, and that unearthing them can unleash a sorrow that is too great to bear. The placid water of Selah's lake keeps its counsel, its silence a testament to the horrors it has witnessed and the secrets it continues to guard. It is a beautiful, peaceful place, and that is the most horrifying thing about it. For we know that beneath that serene reflection of the sky lies a cellar, and in that cellar lie the echoes of a darkness that time can never wash away.